Welcome back to the podcast Teachability, teaching about sustainable cities and communities in the classroom. So, in today's episode, we will be looking at Goal 11.2 of Sustainability Goal 11, Sustainable Cities and Communities, which states that by 2030, we would want to provide access to safe, affordable, accessible, and sustainable transport systems for all, improving road safety, notably by expanding public transport with special attention to the needs of those in vulnerable situations. This would include women, children, persons with disabilities, and older persons. So today, we are interviewing Kirsten Bach. So, can you please introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Kirsten Botter. I am a lecturer at a university for teacher trainers, and I taught previously 15 years internationally, different ages, between the ages of 3 and 18, and worked in management of various international schools globally as well, really focusing in the Middle East and in Europe.
In what specific countries have you lived and worked in?
I've lived and worked in the Netherlands, in Scotland, Estonia, Bulgaria, Switzerland, and Dubai in the Middle East.
Wow, that's a huge range of experiences. So clearly you've seen a lot of different levels of sustainability in different nations.
Absolutely. I mean, if you consider what we saw, for example, connected with this, if you think about transport that I saw in the Middle East and Dubai, hugely different to transport that I would maybe have seen in Bulgaria, where you would literally still see horse and cart across the road together with black tinted windowed BMWs. So yeah, big range.
Very interesting. So in your opinion, what is the purpose of this SDG goal number 11, Sustainable Cities and Communities? Why was it made?
If you think about environmental situations, climate change, all of that sort of thing, I'd imagine that a lot of that was connected with this as well. We're certainly living in a society where the vast majority of people in educated societies are more aware of climate change and the dangers as well of it, and also about what they're doing themselves with travel. So I think that certainly plays a part. Safety also, if you look at road records, traffic accidents tend to increase rather than decrease every single year. And if you look at things like environmental issues like smog, and certain countries, especially if you look at countries in the Far East, are hugely perceptive to this. I think all of that is all connected to transport in some way, shape or form. So I imagine that the idea behind this is targeted very much at that. Also financially, of course, things are not always sustainable the way in which we're carrying on at the moment, and every country of course has different economic abilities, and I think that's also very much connected to this.
Absolutely. So what sort of experience have you had with this strand of SDG goal number 11 in your life or in your teaching?
So when I lived in Dubai, for example, I taught at a very large international school. It had about 2,000 students aged between 3 and 18, and the vast majority of our students who were there were incredibly privileged. Half of them were local Emiratis and the other half were from all over the world. We had 80 different nationalities in total. If I looked at some of our children, to give you an example of something that I thought was preposterous at the time, was I had identical twins in an early years class, 3 years old, who each had their own driver. So they were driven to school individually, each in a stretch limousine by their drivers themselves. So they're coming from the same house and they're travelling to the same school building and they're going in separate cars. Now that for me was absolute nonsense, absolutely preposterous. And then you compare it with what I saw when I was teaching in Bulgaria, where the vast majority of our kids came from from a very different background to what I'd seen in Dubai. Certainly not financially stable backgrounds and families at all. They were either walking to school or they were taking the bus, and by bus, again, the public transport there was very different to what I was used to. The public buses, the floors were missing in a lot of them. You had to be very careful where you put your feet because they were all very old buses that they'd inherited from other countries that had basically discarded them because they were no longer fit for use. So that contrast for me was huge as a teacher. Teaching also about transport in classrooms, it seems like it's a standard kind of module that's done in early years classrooms, and most of my experiences with early years kids. When I taught in Switzerland and we looked at transport, we looked, for example, at what used to be a very common mode of transport in Switzerland and isn't used as much, also due to climate change, which was with dogs and sledges. So we took the class out and we had a whole day with the huskies and the sleds in the mountains so they could experience how that was done and how you could take things with you and how you had to be careful with distribution of weight, etc. So incorporated a lot of different subject areas. So that was a very local, very relevant thing for the kids to be doing.
That's so interesting. So when you've taught about transport in your early years classrooms, did it ever come back to the topic of sustainable forms of transport?
We used to always look at what was the cheapest way of doing things and what was the most effective way of doing things. So because they're only 3-4 years old, their perception of distance is very difficult for them, and time as well doesn't make much sense for them. That if you tell them it takes a minute or if you tell them it takes an hour, they won't necessarily know or feel what the difference is there. So we used to look at things like, if I want to get from school and I want to go to and they all knew maybe the local supermarket or wherever, if I want to go there, which form of transport am I going to take? Will I take a helicopter? Will I walk? Will I take the train, etc., etc.? And why would I take these ones? So which one would be quickest? Which one is the most affordable, which is the cheapest? So we'd look at those 3 different areas, and we also would try things out. So obviously I couldn't conjure up a helicopter to take us to the local shops, but we could certainly look at, if I take, where I was teaching in Switzerland, for example, Geneva was very close by. Let's go by bus, let's see how long that takes, what it costs. Let's go by train, let's see how long that takes and what it costs. Let's walk. And we would get to a point where they couldn't walk anymore and they'd be exhausted. Are we anywhere near there yet? No, we're not. Right, why would we not walk? Because it takes too long, etc. So making it realistic and relevant for them where they are at that moment in time.
That's so important as well for cultural understanding and teaching, to make sure you're being aware of the knowledge of your student body. I love that. So why do you think this sustainable and accessible public transport is important?
You're thinking about the future for everybody, right? For yourselves, for the future generations. If we think about things like climate change, it's hugely damaging what's happening at the moment, and I think the powers that be like to turn a blind eye because it's financially not in their best interest always to pay attention to this. However, something that I find very difficult is that it tends to be older generations that affect the way in which the younger generations are going to be leading their lives. And as a teacher, I think you've got the power to be able to support your kids in change, in bringing about change. And if we look at our young activist from Sweden, Greta Thunberg, how she's developed this huge voice that people are listening to, it's very much the younger generations that are sitting up and taking notice, and she's become this real role model for them, and I think that's fantastic. So encouraging them, making them aware of what's going on is vital. But also financially, it's not something that necessarily needs to cost a lot. We can also live relatively harmoniously together and support each other to achieve things. So those things for me are really important. Perhaps a little bit naive in that I think everything could be glossy and rosy, but if we don't try, then we'll certainly never achieve it.
So have you been in touch with this SDG goal somewhere else? So some other aspects of SDG goal number 11 are protecting and safeguarding the world's natural heritage, having green public spaces in cities, and also safe and affordable and sustainable housing.
Where I lived in the northeast of Scotland in Aberdeen, well, first of all, Scotland is a small country size-wise, but it's a big country when trying to travel. It has only one motorway in the entire country, so it can take you a long time to get from A to B because it tends to be lots of B roads, right? And lots of country roads and things which take a longer time to drive over than a motorway does. Now in the northeast of Scotland, there's a lot of trade and business in the northeast because it's the hub for lots of the oil companies that are based offshore, and Aberdeen is the nearest biggest city. And there was a lot of talk about how there needed to be a bypass road that allowed you effectively to drive faster, quicker, avoiding the small little villages that you were going through and getting you from A to B a lot faster. The discussion for getting this bypass created started when I first lived in Aberdeen when I was 4 years old, and it was finally opened 2 years ago. So it took them almost 35 years to get this road sorted out. And one of the reasons why it took them such a long time is because there was so much opposition to opening the road, because it went through green spaces. It went through a place where there was, for example, a community that had set up, well, it was a huge community area for people with learning support needs, where they all lived together, where they worked together. They had, for example, a bakery where they could bake bread, and then local Aberdonians would come in and buy their bread from them. And it was effectively a way for them to have a relatively stable way of life in a safe environment. But the bypass was going to cut straight through that land as well. So the opposition to it was huge. And certainly as a community member of some different points, I lived there various different times in my life, I never supported the bypass because it was going to affect the green space and because it was going to affect the lives of these people. So ultimately the the government took care of them and relocated them elsewhere. But the green space is gone forever because there's now a giant dual carriageway road that's going through it. So that would probably be one of my most relevant experiences where we also had a voice, right? We were all allowed to vote. Did we want it? Did we not want it?
Why is this particular SDG goal so important to you?
I have a stepson who's 7 years old, and there are so many things that I wish for him, of course, right? I want him to be happy, I want him to be healthy, and I want him to have the best possible future that he can have. That best possible future that he can have, and that any child can have, is going to be one where they're safe, where they're heard, where they're able to lead their lives in the way in which they wish to lead them. And one of the things that falls under that category is safety in transport as well. If we look at what I saw a meme recently, right, where I saw this image of these flying cars, and underneath somebody had written what we thought transport was going to look like in 2020. Now 2020 is next year. We don't have any flying cars, to the best of my knowledge, that we're all going to be able to use soon. But ultimately, it generates so many job opportunities for people as well when we look at alternative ways of transportation, when we look at alternative fuel costs. You can easily argue, of course, that it takes people out of jobs also, but ultimately things like gas, etc., is there a never-ending supply? Most likely not. So if there's not, what's next? So let's create more students, more children who are excited by science, STEM subjects, etc., and get them involved in this and help them create a better future also for themselves. So for me, it's all about the next generation. Of course, we want to be happy and healthy ourselves also, but we're just here as visitors, as guests, until the next generation takes over, in my opinion.
So, on to the teaching portion of this. Do you think it is important to teach children about this SDG goal and this strand?
Yes, absolutely, for really all the reasons that we've just gone through as well, is that they've got so much opportunity to have an impact on the way in which their lives are led themselves. And the only way in which you can have an impact on something is when you're made aware of something in the first place. So I don't imagine that there are huge amounts of families that sit around the dinner table at night and talk about the Sustainable Development Goals in great detail. And I don't imagine that there are many parents that would maybe read them at bedtime, etc., to their children, whilst potentially they maybe be exposed to it on news programmes or something like that. I think a lot of information about things like the SDGs are really achieved through the classroom, through the teacher. So yes, certainly it's got a place in the classroom, and the teacher is responsible to communicate this sort of thing. Yeah.
So now for the difficult question, how would you implement this in your teaching?
I think it's important firstly to share about all of the SDGs, why they are there, what they're for, what the purpose is, who made them, who signed up to agree to it all, etc. So that you understand the background of something. Otherwise it becomes such a standalone thing which isn't meaningful, and as soon as we know something's no longer meaningful, you already have lost almost half of your student body's interest level. So understanding the background, where it's come from, first of all. Depending obviously on the age that you're teaching, you would be doing very different things. So certainly, like I said, with the little kids, where we were really trying things out and we were exploring different forms of transport, which also involved things like skippy balls, right? Giant inflatable balls that you can bounce on. Like, are they practical forms of transport? Are they something which we could use? And trying stuff out, right? What does it cost? Is it expensive? Do we have to work lots and lots of hours to be able to afford it? Or is it something that everybody is able to afford regardless of where they live and what their income is? So we look at that sort of thing. I had them bouncing across the playground. We had them walking on tin cans. Do you walk any quicker when you're doing that, etc. So really thinking about the money aspect, the safety aspect. Is this a safe way to travel? Like, can I go across the motorway by crawling? Is that safer and quicker than by driving? And then when you look at older children, you're effectively extending, or I would effectively extend those activities so they're much more relevant. So really looking at the cost and thinking about it as a transdisciplinary subject, so something that you can teach throughout all of your different subject areas, because that, again, for me makes the most sense, and I think for the kids then as well, where you're connecting maths in a logical, meaningful way, connecting geography, etc. So really being aware of those factors, but also looking at where they're living at that moment in time. Because when you consider, if I consider the kids that I was teaching in Switzerland, for example, but their knowledge of anywhere outside of their bubble of where they'd travelled before, which consisted usually only of where they lived at that moment, the countries of origin of their parents, either one or two if it wasn't Switzerland, and then holiday locations, which for the very privileged children in my class tended to be countries like the Maldives and the Seychelles. Their understanding and their awareness of other countries that they will probably never travel to, at least not while they're still in the family home. There's a lot of background information that needs to be shared with them first as well, making them aware of this. So initially I'd start with what have we got here and in our bubble, what makes sense to us here where we are now, and what have you experienced anywhere else? So what have you seen in your holidays in the Maldives? How do people travel around there, and why do they use that approach to travel, and who uses it as well? Because there are countries also where public transport is very much seen to be used by people who aren't as well off and as wealthy as people who are able to drive cars. And there's almost a stigma attached to it. Now, it's obvious that people who have more money are probably more likely to have a car than those who don't. But for there to be a stigma attached to it is something that also needs to be evaporated. Like if I think about my experience in Dubai, they opened a monorail throughout the city, and it became something very quickly, which, well, everybody went on the first day that it was open to try it out because it was something that was new and exciting. But literally from on day 2 onwards, it became the mode of transport for the poor workers, as opposed to for anybody who had any money, although it's a fantastic resource and it almost costs nothing to use. So I think focusing on other countries, on their systems, on their beliefs as well of how something works, why it works in that way, who it's intended for, I would also talk about that and use discussions. So, I mean, you could look in your upper primary class, for example, and have the children choose a country themselves and do a research project on it, right? And then have some sort of presentation. If you think about the PYP, they can connect it. PYP, the Primary Years Programme, is the primary curriculum really for an IB, an International Baccalaureate School. So it's used in many international schools globally, and it's a curriculum framework. So they don't dictate specifically what you have to teach. They don't tell you how you have to teach it, except that it has to be through an inquiry-based approach. But it allows you a lot of space and a lot of room to teach what is important for the children in that place and time in which you are teaching them. And then with the little ones, you can also still talk about their experiences of travel, like when you've gone somewhere, when you went to visit Granny and Grandad in Canada, how did you get there and why didn't you swim, right? Or why did you take the plane? Why the plane and not a helicopter, etc. And getting them to experience as many different forms of transport as possible, I think, is key as well, that they actually understand how things work, how they operate, what sort of methods these transports are used to be projected forward, right? Are they using gas? Are they using electricity? Are they using solar power? So talking about those things is possible with little children as well. They're capable of more than we give them credit for usually.
So one difficult aspect, especially of this strand, is that students or children in general don't really get a choice in how they transport to school or to the store or whatnot. So how would you think that you could not only implement this in the classroom to affect their mindsets, but also to engender change?
Part of it, I think, also is educating parents. So potentially you could have the students, like I just said, you could have them creating some sort of presentation, invite the parents in, get the children to share what they've learned with their parents, make them aware of what's going on. Have that presentation as much as possible in the early evening as opposed to during the day, because working families are just most likely not going to be able to send somebody who can support them. In the wealthier international schools, potentially the nanny might be attending, but the nanny usually is not the voice of reason in a family. Invite local governmental bodies to your presentations as well. So invite the local minister or the mayor of the town or anybody in some sort of position of power in politics as well in the local area needs to be invited to these things. Sending an invitation and following up with that invitation as well, I think, is really important, because it indicates to children that you always have a voice in politics as well in a democratic society. And the only way in which you can also drive change is when you make people aware of the things that you want to change. So get them involved as much as possible also. Give them some form of challenge. I've worked in schools where we had had like walk to school week, right? And we encouraged people as much as possible to walk to school, and then we changed the opening time to bring into account that maybe some kids need a good half hour or 45 minutes to walk in. So school starts at 10 a.m. or whatever for this entire week, but you have to walk in to some extent. So if you live miles and miles out, stop 5 kilometres earlier and then walk the rest of the way. We had walking buses, that we called them walking buses in Switzerland, where we had sort of bus stops that we indicated. So for example, this restaurant in this village, or lamppost in that little town, and it would be the point where all the kids who lived nearby would meet there in the morning, and they would walk in pairs, like a walking bus, to school. So the big kids at the front and at the back, and the little ones in the middle, and that's how they would come into school. No adult supervision at all. That can also only really be done in a safe society. But so doing things like that and allowing them to share what they're doing. Use social media. Kids are perfectly capable of using it. You're also teaching them how to use it safely. We had a Twitter profile in my kindergarten class that we used every single day. So share what you're doing with the global world and make people aware of it. Skype with schools in other countries and ask them what they are doing and tell them what you're doing, and share experiences so that you can learn from each other also. And promote it, so contact local press and make what's being done heard. But certainly informing people in positions of power of what's happening, I think, is really important. But also giving the children the idea that they can be empowered also, and they're the ones ultimately that can drive the change, I think is vital.
I'm so glad that you brought up involving governmental figures to actually make change in the community or city. One thing I always think about is, how do you bring that same education to the students in countries or societies where it isn't a democratic society, or where you really don't have much say in the government? How can you still bring sustainable transport to the school community, let's say?
I think certainly it's always possible to look at what is being done elsewhere, not with this idea of, oh, look, this is what's being done somewhere else and that means that they're doing it perfectly and poor you is never going to be the same for you, or it's never going to be achievable here. But if you don't make people aware of what is possible, then they're also not going to try to drive change. So looking at possibilities is one thing. I think having open and honest discussions with them about what they could potentially do. Okay, maybe they can't affect the biggest bosses in different corporations, but you can start somewhere. So how can we discuss this, and how can we incorporate change within our classroom first of all? How can we make sure that spreads to the wider school community? How can we then make sure that turns into the local community? So really building things up gradually. Again, perhaps naive to think that you could have a huge impact and that you could change things for the better. But if lots of people are doing little things, then sometimes change can happen and will happen. Again, I think we live in a world at the moment where social media seems to be like the kind of most dominant way in which we can achieve change and achieve change and make people aware of what's happening. Obviously with a real pinch of salt as well added to it, because a lot of things that we see online aren't necessarily true or based on any sort of fact. But allowing students to the feeling of, I've got a voice and it can be heard by others, is also really important. Connecting them with children or students in other schools, in other countries, and hearing what they are doing as well can be hugely inspiring and give them ideas of what they can do themselves. I think the key thing for a teacher as well is make them aware of a situation, but don't tell them what to do, because ultimately that's never going to be successful if we're dictating to them. So giving them the tools and the opportunities to find out what they can do. They're going to come up with 1,000 more creative things than I ever would, because that's what they do. They don't have the inhibitions that we have of, oh, someone thinks this is going to be a dreadful idea, I better not say it. They'll say and try anything if you give them the opportunity.
Coincidentally, that's actually a big part of our podcast project. We want to start these episodes as a stimulus and actually not have an end and not have a conclusion episode, and invite students around the world to make more and contribute more and have better ideas than us, because we're sure they will. So that's so interesting that you brought that up, because that's really what we're trying to do with this project. How would you teach about different types of sustainable transport to make sure that students are actually aware of the impact, let's say, taking a flight has?
So first of all, I think you need to generate with the children a list of what they believe are the means of transport, first of all, and they'll probably come up with all sorts of things that I necessarily wouldn't have thought of. But starting again from very basic foundation, I think, is really important. Then I think we need to look at things like, what does each mode of transport cost to cover a certain distance at a certain speed? Because there's no point in saying, okay, walking is free and taking the bus costs this much, and taking the car would cost this much for a certain distance, because the speed also has some sort of impact. So really bringing maths into that again, which is fantastic because it's transdisciplinary, but so looking at cost per distance per speed as well, I think is really important, so they're aware of that. Then also looking at things like carbon emissions, what sort of impact does it have on the climate when I take an aeroplane or when I drive this certain distance, and considering as well own actions. So okay, you went on holiday to this and that country, how did you get there, why did you choose that mode of transport? Because it was cheaper, because it was quicker, and considering those sorts of actions of what are you doing. So for example, we had a weekend in Venice recently where when we came back, some friends of ours said, but why didn't you take the train, it's a really nice journey. But taking a train, is that appropriate mode of transport for when you're only in the destination city for 2 days? Probably not, because you're probably travelling for the duration of the 2 days that you've got. So then you have to consider, why am I doing this trip? Is it really necessary that I go? But that's a huge mindset change, and I think certainly people, I'm a generation older than you guys, or two maybe, I don't know. For us, when I was a student, cheap plane fares were really coming about, and it was something that we were always really excited about, and there was never any talk about in the media to any extent at that point about carbon emissions and the impact of your carbon footprint, whereas now it's something which is spoken about so much more. So let's watch videos of people who know what they're talking about telling us about it. Let's access that information by knowledgeable people who can share it with us as well, because we need to know where we can find that information. We need to be able to look at it critically, we need to be able to analyse what's being said, be able to indicate as well whether it's valid, whether it's valuable, or whether it's not. So there's so many different learning aspects and elements that come into this, which make it really interesting and exciting to do. But again, it's making them aware of what's happening and making them aware of where they can find the information, so that it's from a trustworthy and reliable source as well.
One last question about teaching. How would you, if you weren't working in a school that had such a loose curriculum, how would you bring this SDG goal into the regular classroom so that you could still incorporate it and teach about it, even if it's not in your prescribed curriculum, and even if you don't have the time because of your busy curriculum?
So if you've got a more prescribed curriculum, I believe there's always an element of flexibility, right? There's always something that I'd be able to forego for, or something that I'd be able to tweak to suit if I wanted to do this. So if I think about using, for example, the national curriculum for England, where you have to use or cover so many hours of reading time, we could read articles that are connected to this SDG, we can read children's literature that's connected to this SDG. We could discuss it when we've got to practice our speaking and listening skills. You can give them discussion topics connected to this SDG, because those are not stipulated. So it's not you have to have a classroom discussion, or there needs to be conversation practice and the focus needs to be this subject. I can choose the subject content myself. So in that respect, I can bring it into the classroom. You always start your day with some form of attendance. You can start the day with attendance of, tell me how you got into school this morning, or tell me what the last time was that you went on holiday and which form of transport you took, or tell me the last time you took public transport, where did you go and why? Tell me the last time you went to a country that had a very different financial situation to the one that you're in now, and how did you get around when you were there? Did you have a private taxi, or did you use public transport, or did you walk? So those things can be always incorporated in, even if it's at lunchtime that you sit with your class and you have a chat with them at lunchtime. That is also, I'm aware that it's working in your break, but every teacher works in their break. So it might as well be in an enjoyable conversational tone, which also could potentially have a deep and meaningful impact or effect on the kids in your class. I would also, as a teacher, if I strongly believed that this needs to be included in my classroom, I would be very confident and happy in going to the head or the school board and stating to them, this isn't covered in the curriculum, but it's vital that the kids are aware of this. Where can we make room? So whether it's a whole school assembly, or that my class gives an assembly to the entire school, or that we have a week where we focus solely on one SDG and every class in the entire school focuses on it and completes different activities. There's always opportunity to build something in. People just need to be able to speak up and challenge what's already there, I think.
Those are wonderfully creative ideas. I loved them. That's such a nice way to really find the small space you have in the curriculum and work with it. So lastly, what tips can you give other teachers to take along for their own teaching?
Something that I think about when I work with the student teachers here is when I have conversations with them, I always kind of think with, would I want this person to be teaching my child? And I think it's the same thing with colleagues, whether I teach with them directly or not, or whether it's colleagues on the other side of the world who I've never met before. Would I want that person working with my child or in a classroom with children and indicating something or teaching them something, making them aware of something that's important? And it makes you reflect so much more on your own practice as well. So I can easily say, yes, I would very much like Caroline to teach my child, but would I want me to teach my child? What do I need to adapt in my own teaching style? And then connect it with this SDG. What would I want my child to know about this, and what would I want him to be empowered to be able to do and achieve and to discover by himself? And how are they going to do that? So again, it's encouraging that reflective ability in people, which everybody has anyway, because after everything that you do in any sort of social context, you always think, did I do that right, or should I have done that differently, or I wish I'd thought of this, or right? And so empowering teachers, colleagues to do the same thing, I think is really important. I'd also suggest to them, don't be afraid to break out of the mould a little bit and to challenge figures of authority. Curricula are so often written by people who are not educators, and you see it in so much of the documentation that it's not being created by an educator who has absolutely no sense of what it's like to teach a class. So when, for example, it's prescriptive, like the national curriculum is, this is generated by people who are sitting in an office in Westminster who don't have any teaching experience 99% of the time. So why are we afraid to challenge it? We challenge anyone in any position if we're not happy with what they're doing. So why don't we challenge ourselves as well with things that we're not happy with? So I would encourage them to do that and aim big, because when you aim big, then you have the potential to have much more impact, even if it means that you start small, but always have a big goal in mind. So if it's to change the entire ethos or the culture of a school, then go for it. And if you need to do that by starting little and getting yourself first of all as the role model, and then your class and then colleagues, then you use it in that way. But don't be afraid of change. It makes your job so much more enjoyable as well, and you've got something to fight for.
Thank you so much for sitting down and talking with me. It was wonderfully insightful. I feel like I learned so much actually just from this conversation.
You're very welcome.
So that concludes our interview with Kirsten Bodden.
You listened to episode 3 of the podcast Sustainability, teaching about sustainable cities and communities. Until next time, and as always, don't forget to be a sustainable citizen.